The gun pressed cold and hard against Hugh Prescott's temple, and Kate Collins watched from across the dusty street of Redemption, Texas, her heart hammering so violently she could hear it above the roar of the wind. "Tell her," Sila's drum snarled, his fingers white-knuckled around the revolver. "Tell her what you really are, Prescott. Tell her about the bounty. Tell her how you've been lying to her face every single day since you rode into this town." Kate's breath caught. The word bounty fell through her like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples destroyed everything she thought she knew. She stared at Hugh, at the sharp jaw she had traced with her fingertips just last night, at the dark eyes that had looked at her with something she had been reckless enough to call love, and she waited for him to deny it. He didn't. Hugh's jaw tightened. He didn't flinch from the barrel at his head, didn't plead, didn't scramble for an excuse. He simply looked at Kate across that 20 feet of sun-hammered Texas dirt, and his expression was the most complicated and most devastating thing she had ever seen on a man's face. It was guilt and grief, and something else she couldn't name yet, something that would take her weeks to understand. "Kate," he said, and her name in his voice sounded like a prayer and an apology knotted together. "Don't you speak to her," Silas snapped, pressing the barrel harder. "She deserves the truth. You came to Redemption to collect her. $500, wasn't it? That's what a woman's life is worth to the men who hired you." Kate's hand dropped to the small pistol holstered at her hip, a habit she had built out of 2 years of surviving alone on the Texas frontier, and she held very still. Sila's drum was a dangerous man with a dangerous temper and a set of loyalties that bent like green wood in heat. He wasn't doing this to protect her. He was doing this because Hugh had gotten in his way, and she knew the difference. But the betrayal still burned. It burned like the August sun overhead, like the grief she had carried every day for the past 3 years since everything she had built had been taken from her, like the terrifying hope she had allowed herself to feel when a tall, quiet stranger with worn boots and honest hands had ridden into town, and somehow, slowly, impossibly, made her believe again. $500. She needed to understand, and to understand she had to go back to where it all began. 3 months earlier, Redemption, Texas had been exactly what its name suggested, a town clinging to the edge of hope with bleeding fingernails. It sat in a shallow valley in the hill country, 40 miles from San Antonio, and in the autumn of 1878 it was a town in trouble. The cattle trails had shifted west. The railroad spur that everyone had expected never came. 3 of the town's 4 merchants had packed up and gone to Abilene, and the ones who remained did so out of stubbornness or poverty or both. Kate Collins remained because Redemption was hers. She had arrived 5 years earlier with her husband Thomas, a schoolteacher from Pennsylvania who had carried a dream of the West in his chest like a second heartbeat. They had built the general store together, board by board, fighting the heat and the rattlesnakes and the loneliness of a frontier that did not care about dreams. Thomas had been good and gentle and utterly unprepared for what the West actually demanded. A fever had taken him in the spring of 1875, and Kate had stood at a shallow grave outside town at the age of 26 and understood that she was entirely alone. She did not leave. She was too stubborn for that, too proud, and if she was honest with herself, too afraid that leaving would mean Thomas had died for nothing. So she ran the store. She learned to handle accounts and manage suppliers in San Antonio and deal with the rough men who came through Redemption on their way to somewhere else. She developed a reputation for being fair and fierce in equal measure, and if men sometimes underestimated her because she was a woman of 29 with dark red hair and a careful smile, she let them. It was useful. What she had not anticipated was Martin Hargrove. Hargrove had come to Redemption 18 months after Thomas's death, presenting himself as an investor from Austin with an interest in frontier commerce. He was well-dressed and smooth-talking and, as Kate later discovered, as crooked as a snake in a windstorm. He had invested in 6 properties across the hill country under false pretenses, taken out loans against land he didn't own, and used the tangled legal confusion of post-Reconstruction Texas to obscure his tracks so thoroughly that even the county sheriff couldn't follow the thread. What he had done to Kate was simpler and more personal. He had convinced her that she needed a business partner, slowly ingratiated himself into her store's accounts, and over the course of 8 months, systematically drained the savings she had built over years of brutal work. By the time she discovered what was happening, he had taken $300 in cash and the deed to the building, transferred through a fraudulent contract she had signed without reading closely enough, a mistake she would flog herself for until the end of her days. Hargrove had disappeared south, toward the border, and Kate was left with a store she technically no longer owned, a town that pitied her, and a rage so clean and cold it was almost like clarity. She had gone to the county sheriff in Fredericksburg, a large man named Oates who smelled of chewing tobacco and spoke slowly, and who listened to her story with the particular expression of a man who has already decided not to do anything. The law in 1878 Texas was a patchwork thing, and a woman's complaint against a clever man with forged paperwork was not the kind of case that earned a lawman any praise. "Miss Collins," Sheriff Oates had said, "even if everything you're saying is true, tracking a man across 2 counties on a civil matter is not something this office has the resources to pursue." "He stole from me," Kate said. "He may have," Oates allowed. "But proving it in a court of law is another matter." She had ridden back to Redemption in a white fury and spent 3 weeks trying to figure out what to do. She had contacted a lawyer in San Antonio who informed her, gently, that the case had merit but that pursuing it would cost money she didn't have. She had written letters to 2 former business contacts of Thomas's in Pennsylvania, letters that came back unopened. She had considered and rejected half a dozen plans that ranged from the practical to the desperate. And then Hugh Prescott rode into Redemption on a gray horse on a Tuesday morning in early September. Kate noticed him the way she noticed most things practically, and from behind the counter of her store. He was tall and lean, somewhere in his early 30s, with the kind of weathered face that came from years outdoors and the kind of eyes that seemed to be calculating distances even when they were looking at nothing in particular. He wore a well-maintained hat, dusty boots, and a plain coat that had seen considerable use. At his hip was a Colt revolver worn low and easy in a holster that showed signs of regular cleaning. He bought flour, salt, coffee, and a box of cartridges. He paid in silver and didn't haggle and didn't flirt, which immediately distinguished him from approximately half the men who came through her store. Passing through, Kate asked because it was useful to know. "Depends," he said. "On what?" He looked at her for a moment with those calculating eyes. "On whether there's work." "What kind of work?" "Whatever needs doing." She had taken that as a non-answer and moved on, but he didn't move on. He rented a room at the small boarding house run by Martha Elkins, and the next morning he appeared in the street outside the store and spent an hour replacing a rotted board on the saloon's front steps without being asked, simply because he noticed it was loose and someone was likely to put a boot through it. The saloon owner, old Abe Greer, came out to protest and ended up paying him $2 because he couldn't argue with the quality of the work. Kate watched this from her doorway and filed it away. His name emerged slowly, the way useful information tended to emerge in small towns, in fragments and overheard pieces. Martha Elkins mentioned he paid his room rent 3 days in advance. Doc Hennessy said the man had asked sensible questions about the nearest water sources. Reverend Cade reported that he had sat in the back pew on Sunday morning and left without speaking to anyone. "He's a drifter," said Mabel Oakes, who ran the town's small cafe and had opinions about everyone. "I've seen 100 like him." "No," Kate said, without being entirely sure why. "He's not." She found out more by accident. 2 weeks after Hugh Prescott arrived in Redemption, she was working late in the store when she heard raised voices from the alley behind the building. She took her pistol and went to look, because in Redemption at night You always took your pistol." Two men she didn't recognize had a young Mexican boy pinned against the wall, demanding money the boy clearly didn't have. The boy's name was Carlos, she would later learn. He was 16, the son of a farmer who worked land 3 miles outside town, and he had come in to buy medicine for his mother and made the mistake of walking back through the dark. Before Kate could decide how to intervene, Hugh Prescott appeared from the opposite end of the alley. He didn't draw his gun. He simply stood there and spoke to the two men in a voice so quiet and so completely certain of itself that they both released the boy and walked away without another word. Kate could not hear what he said. She only saw its effect. Hugh turned and watched the boy go, making sure he reached the main street safely, and then he turned and looked directly at Kate standing in the doorway of her store. "You should go back inside," he said. "It's dealt with." "I had it handled," she replied. Something that might have been amusement moved briefly across his face. "I know you did," he said. "I saw the gun." She had not expected that. Most men would have made something of it, dismissed it, or been irritated by it, or made a joke. He simply acknowledged it as a fact and left it at that. That was the night she started paying real attention to Hugh Prescott. She began testing him, the way she tested everything carefully, obliquely, watching for the cracks. She engaged him in conversation about the store's accounts, mentioning numbers and watching his reactions. She asked his opinion on the county surveyor's new maps and noted that he had a solid working knowledge of land law. She invited him, along with 3 other men, to help repair the roof of the church after a storm, and she watched how he worked and how he spoke to the others, and how he handled the moment when one of the men made a crude joke at her expense. He shut it down with 3 words and didn't make a ceremony of it. By October, she had offered him informal work as a handyman and informal security for the store. He accepted without making any declarations about the nature of the arrangement. By the middle of October, she was lying awake thinking about him in ways that had nothing to do with business, and hating herself for it, because she was a practical woman who had made one enormous mistake in the matter of trusting too easily, and she was not going to make another. She kept waiting for the hidden motive. Every man who had come to redemption with quiet competence and easy manner had, in her experience, wanted something they weren't saying directly. Hugh Prescott seemed to want nothing beyond fair pay for honest work, and that made her more suspicious, not less. "You're going to wear yourself out looking for reasons not to trust him," said Martha Elkins one afternoon over tea, with the gentle precision of a woman who had been watching people navigate their feelings for 40 years. "Some men are just what they appear to be." "Nobody is just what they appear to be," Kate said. Martha smiled. "Almost nobody," she conceded. The night that changed things came at the end of October, when Kate was sitting at her desk after closing, working through the quarterly accounts by lamplight. She had been trying to reconstruct exactly how much Hargrove had taken, building the kind of careful documentary evidence that the lawyer in San Antonio had told her she would need. She had spread papers across every inch of the desk: receipts, ledger entries, the fraudulent contract, and she was so deep in concentration that she didn't hear the door open until Hugh spoke. "Your front lock doesn't catch," he said. She looked up. He was standing in the doorway holding a small metal tool, apparently having just fixed it. "I know," she said. "I've been meaning to. Done now." He set the tool on the counter and glanced at the papers spread across her desk. He didn't ask about them. He was careful that way. But she was tired. She had been alone with this for too long, and there was something about the lamplight and the late hour, and the fact that he had come in quietly and fixed something without being asked, and she found herself talking before she fully decided to. She told him about Thomas. She told him about the store and the years of building it. She told him about Hargrove, the whole story, every detail, not softening any of it, including her own foolishness in signing the contract. She told him about Sheriff Oates and the lawyer and the dead ends, and the cold fact that Martin Hargrove was somewhere south of here, free and comfortable and untouched, while she ran a store she no longer legally owned and paid rent to a man who held the deed Hargrove had stolen. Hugh listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Do you know where he went?" he asked. "South," she said. "There are rumors he has associates near Del Rio. That's all I have." He nodded slowly as though he was filing the information somewhere. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked, not unkindly. "I don't know," she said, which was mostly true. "Maybe because you didn't ask." Something shifted in his expression then, not the brief amusement she had seen before, but something slower and more serious. "I'll ask you something now," he said. "All right. Are you safe? The man holding the deed on this building, does he leave you alone?" She blinked. Of all the questions she had expected, it was not that one. "Yes," she said. "Sela's drum is he's difficult, but he's not threatening me physically. He just wants his rent money." "Sela's drum," Hugh repeated, and there was something in the way he said the name, a flicker of something that Kate couldn't quite read. "You know him?" she asked. "I know the name," Hugh said carefully. "Most people in this part of Texas do." She let it go. She was tired and the hour was late, and she had already said more than she intended. "Thank you for the lock," she said. He nodded and left, and Kate sat in the quiet of the store with the lamp burning low and felt, despite everything, slightly less alone than she had felt in years. November came in cold and clear, the way hill country winters did, with frost on the grass in the mornings and brilliant blue sky by midday. Kate and Hugh settled into a pattern that was professional on the surface, and unmistakably something else underneath. He helped around the store, accompanied her on the twice-monthly ride to Fredericksburg to collect supplies, and gradually became the person she found herself wanting to talk to at the end of the day. He was quiet about himself in a way that she recognized, because she had learned to be quiet about herself too. But she gathered pieces. He was from Missouri originally. He had worked as a scout for the Army during the Red River War of 1874. He had ranched for 2 years after that, somewhere in the Panhandle. He had a sister in Kansas City, married to a printer, who he wrote letters to occasionally. He had no particular religion but respected those who did. He believed in paying his debts and holding his word, and in Kate's experience, these were the two most reliable character indicators a person could demonstrate. She discovered that he could read Latin, which startled her. He had studied at a small college in Missouri for a year before a family financial crisis ended that chapter. He carried a copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations in his coat pocket, worn almost to pieces. She had found it on the counter one day and opened it without thinking, and when he came back and saw her reading it, he didn't snatch it away or look embarrassed. He simply asked what she thought. "He keeps saying everything is temporary," she said. "Yes." "Is that supposed to be comforting?" Hugh considered this seriously. "I think it's supposed to be clarifying. If everything is temporary, you stop wasting your time on things that don't matter." "What matters then?" He looked at her with those direct, dark eyes. "That's the question, isn't it?" She felt heat in her face and looked back at the book. The first time he touched her deliberately was in early November, when she was coming down the ladder from the store's high shelves and missed a rung. She didn't fall far, 3 feet at most, but he caught her with both hands, solid and sure, and held her steady until she had her footing. He kept his hands at her waist 1 moment longer than was strictly necessary, and she kept her hands on his forearms 1 moment longer than she should have, and they were very close together in the narrow aisle between the shelving and the counter, and the world went very quiet. "Thank you," she said when she could speak normally. "Careful on those rungs," he said, but his voice was different, lower, and he stepped back with a deliberateness that told her he had noticed the quiet too. That night Kate lay in the small back room of the store where she slept, staring at the ceiling, and had a very direct conversation with herself. She was 29 years old. She had been widowed for 3 years. She was lonely genuinely, deeply lonely in a way that the demands of survival had let her paper over but never actually address. Hugh Prescott was a man she liked and trusted, as much as she trusted anyone, and there was clearly something between them that was building with the slow inevitability of a weather system moving in from the west. The question was whether to let it build. The danger was the thing she didn't know. She didn't know his secrets. Every person had them, and his were still locked up behind those careful, measuring eyes. She had believed she knew Thomas, and Thomas had not deceived her. Thomas had simply been wrong about the West and wrong about himself, which was its own kind of tragedy but not a betrayal. Hargrove had been a deliberate and calculated deception. She did not think Hugh Prescott was a Hargrove, but she was aware that she had been wrong before. Still, the way he had said her name in the lamplight, the first time he used it, Kate, not Miss Collins, had done something to the carefully maintained composure she had spent 3 years constructing, and she was not sure she could unknow that. November stretched on. One evening, after the store was closed and the accounts were done, she poured 2 glasses of whiskey from a bottle she kept for exceptional circumstances and handed him one without explanation. He took it without question. They sat on the front porch of the store in the cold, watching the last light go out of the sky above the hills, and she asked him the question she had been carrying. "What are you really doing in redemption?" He turned the glass in his hands. "Honest answer. Always." "I came through redemption by accident," he said. "I was heading somewhere else. I had a job of a kind that was taking me south, but I got here and he paused. I saw what the town was and what it needed, and I found a reason to stay." "What was the job?" The pause before his answer was a fraction of a second too long. "Tracking someone," he said. Her instincts prickled. "Tracking," she repeated. "I've done work for lawyers, investigators, finding men who have run from debts or legal proceedings. It pays well and I'm good at it." "And the job that brought you south?" Another pause. He looked at the sky. "It's not relevant anymore," he said. "I let it go." She studied his profile in the failing light. She didn't press. She had told herself that she didn't press because she understood the value of privacy, that some doors opened in their own time and prying at them only broke the hinges. That was true. But it was also true that she was afraid of what might be behind that particular door, and sometimes the most dangerous thing a person could do was be honest with themselves about their own fear. "All right," she said. He looked at her then, a look of such direct and serious attention that she felt it like a physical thing. "Kate," he said, "I want you to know something." "What?" "Whatever brought me here doesn't change what's kept me here." She held that for a long moment, then nodded once. It was not a declaration. It was not a promise. But it was something true, and she had learned to value truth above most other things. 2 days later, in the middle of the afternoon, Sela's drum came into the store. Kate had been expecting him. He was due his monthly rent payment, and Sela's drum had a tendency to arrive for money precisely on time, like a particularly unpleasant timepiece. He was a heavy-set man in his mid-40s, with a broad face and small eyes, and the kind of self-satisfied authority that came from having accumulated property in a poor town during poor years, which made everyone dependent on him whether they wanted to be or not. He owned the building she occupied, 2 others on the main street, and a section of land south of town that he had acquired through methods Kate had never been able to fully investigate. He was not likable, but in the way of many unlikable men in positions of local power, he was considered by many to be simply a fact of life. He paid his rent and gave her a look that lingered too long. "I hear you've taken on a man," he said. "I've hired someone to help with repairs and security," Kate said. Security, Drum seemed to find this amusing. "For a general store. There have been incidents." "I heard about the alley business," Drum said, and something shifted in his expression, not concern, not approval, just a calculation she couldn't quite read. "Where'd this fellow come from?" "Missouri, I believe," Kate said. "He's a capable hand and a trustworthy one." "What's his name?" she told him, watching his face carefully. And there, just there, behind the small eyes, something moved. Recognition or something very like it. "I'll keep that in mind," Drum said, and left without further comment. Kate kept her expression neutral until the door closed, and then stood very still behind the counter for a long minute, thinking. That evening she told Hugh that Drum had asked about him. She watched his face with the same careful attention she had been developing over the past 2 months, and what she saw was a controlled, deliberate neutrality that was itself informative. A man with nothing to hide would have shrugged. Hugh Prescott managed his reaction with the precision of someone filing it away for consideration. "He knows who you are," she said. "It wasn't a question." "It's possible," Hugh said. "I've moved around. My name is known in certain circles." "What circles?" He met her gaze. "Legal ones," he said. "And not always." She waited. He said, "There are things about my past I should have told you sooner. I know that. I've been trying to find the right moment, which is a coward's excuse." "Then tell me now," she said. He told her. Not everything, she would later realize, but enough. He had worked as a bounty hunter for 4 years, from 1874 to 1878, out of San Antonio. He had brought in wanted men across Texas and New Mexico for the fees posted by courts and private parties. He had done it legally, mostly. There were 1 or 2 instances on the edges he wasn't proud of, and he had stopped because he found the work increasingly troubling to the part of himself that held the Marcus Aurelius in his pocket. The money was good, but the cost was not. What he did not tell her, what she would not learn until Sela's drum pressed a gun to his head 3 months later, was the specific job that had brought him to the hill country in September. He described it obliquely as a matter he had walked away from before it could cause harm. He said it was over. He looked at her with complete steadiness when he said it. She believed him. That was her mistake, or at least the fragment of it that would hurt the most. Not because he was lying exactly, but because the thing he called over was considerably more complicated than that simple word implied. December came, and with it the particular intimacy of cold weather in a small town, when people drew closer together simply because warmth was scarce and company was one of the few free things available. Kate's store became a gathering place in the evenings. She had always kept it open a few hours past dark for the sociability of it, and Hugh became a fixture of those evenings, sitting by the stove, playing cards occasionally, talking with the townspeople in the quiet way that had gradually won him a kind of respect that didn't require announcement. The children liked him, which Kate observed with a complicated feeling she refused to name directly. He was patient with them in the matter-of-fact way of a man who didn't perform patience but simply had it. He fixed Carlos's father's wagon wheel one Saturday for nothing, just because the man was struggling with it in the road and Hugh happened to be passing. She was falling in love with him. She knew it. She admitted it to herself on a cold December night when she caught herself smiling at the thought of him before she was fully awake, and then immediately sat up in bed and had a stern internal conversation about caution and common sense, and the specific foolishness of opening your heart to a man you didn't fully know. But she knew something. She knew the way he thought, the way he held himself accountable, the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't looking, with a kind of reverence that a man of his careful nature would not waste on someone he didn't value absolutely. She had learned to read people by necessity, and what she read in Hugh Prescott was not performance. It was real. Christmas approached. Kate put a small pine branch in a jar of water on the store counter and hung 2 paper stars in the window, because the townspeople needed whatever small beauty could be managed, and she had always understood that it was the small gestures that held a community together. Martha Elkins brought fruitcake. Reverend Cade organized a carol service in the unfinished church. Abe Greer provided whiskey punch from behind the saloon bar, which technically violated the spirit of the carol service, but which the Reverend was persuaded to overlook. Hugh stood next to Kate during the carols, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and when she shivered in the cold night air, he moved without thought, or rather with a thought he'd stopped editing, and put his arm around her shoulders. She stiffened for half a second out of pure reflex, and then she let herself lean, just slightly, into the warmth of him. They walked back to the store afterward in the dark, the town silent around them. At the store door she turned to say good night and found him much closer than she expected. Both of them stopped, the cold air between them visible in small clouds of breath. "Kate," he said, and the prayer and apology in it was there even then. She realized later, even then, when he was about to do something gentle and good, the weight of what he hadn't told her was already in his voice. She kissed him first. She decided that later he could claim to have made the first move if it helped his dignity. But the truth was that she had leaned forward half an inch before he covered the distance, and she knew it. The kiss was brief and cold-lipped and entirely undeniable, and when she pulled back she looked at him in the dark and felt something in her chest loosen that had been tightened for years. "Good night, Hugh," she said. "Good night, Kate," he said. She went inside. She did not sleep for a very long time. January of 1879 came in with a cold north wind and a series of events that Kate would spend years untangling. The first was a letter. It arrived at the Fredericksburg post office, addressed to her in a hand she didn't recognize, and it contained a single sheet of paper with the following. "Miss Collins, the man calling himself Hugh Prescott was hired last August by parties connected to Sela's Drum to locate you and report on your situation regarding the Hargrove matter. He is not what he seems. Be careful who you trust. A friend." The letter was unsigned. The handwriting was neat and deliberate and entirely anonymous. Kate read it 3 times, standing in the post office with the cold January air coming in under the door, and felt the world rearrange itself around her in the specific way it did when a piece of information didn't destroy what you knew but tilted it at an angle that changed everything about the perspective. She rode back to Redemption in silence, the letter in her pocket, and she did not speak to Hugh that day or the day after. She was not ready to confront him until she knew what the confrontation would reveal. She needed facts, not feelings, because feelings had the dangerous habit of making her find the most charitable interpretation when the most accurate one might be something worse. She went to see Doc Hennessy, who was Redemption's closest thing to a historian, being the longest resident citizen and the keeper of whatever unofficial records the town had accumulated. She asked him, carefully and indirectly, about Sela's Drum, specifically about Drum's business interests and the various people he had employed or contracted over the years. Hennessy was a small, precise man with spectacles and the mild expression of someone who had seen too much medical reality to be surprised by human behavior. He listened to her questions and then looked at her over his glasses with the expression of a man deciding how honest to be. "Sela's Drum," he said finally, "has been engaged in property acquisition of a legally questionable nature for the better part of a decade. The Hargrove situation was not isolated. My understanding, and this is the understanding of a country doctor, mind you, not a lawyer, is that Hargrove worked for Drum in some capacity and that the deed to your store was the intended result." Kate sat very still. "Hargrove worked for Drum. That is my strong suspicion," Hennessy said. "I have no documentary proof, and I've said nothing because saying it without proof would only make Drum angry and make me a target of that anger. And if someone were hired to determine whether I had documentation proof of the fraud, that someone would be working for Drum's interests," Kate said. Hennessy looked at her carefully. "That would follow, yes." Kate walked out of the doctor's office into the cold January street and stood in the wind with her hands in her coat pockets and thought about Hugh Prescott for a long, quiet, precise moment. He had been hired to find her, to assess the Hargrove situation. He was a tracker, a finder, she knew that. He had told her that himself. And if Drum had hired him to determine whether she had enough evidence to pursue the fraud claim, then Hugh had spent 3 months in her store, earning her trust, listening to her story, and reporting back to the man who had orchestrated the theft of her livelihood. The fury that rose in her was cold and total, the kind that didn't announce itself in tears or shaking but sat in the chest like a stone, dense and still. And then she thought about everything else. She thought about the alley, the fixed lock, the meditations in his coat pocket, the Christmas carol, the kiss, the way he had looked at her when he said, "Whatever brought me here doesn't change what's kept me here." Either all of that was performance, which was possible and which she had to hold as possible, or some of it, maybe most of it, was real. And somewhere in that distinction was the truth of who Hugh Prescott actually was. She went back to the store and waited. He came at the usual time, and she gave him no indication that anything had changed. She needed one more piece of information before she was ready to act. Over the next 3 days, she made subtle inquiries. She wrote to the attorney in San Antonio and asked him to make discreet inquiries about any recent investigative work connected to the Hargrove fraud case, specifically any work commissioned from the Hill Country area. She spoke to a traveling merchant who knew the legal circles in Austin and asked him to pass a message requesting information about bounty work and Silas Drum's name. The merchant came back through 5 days later with a reply that contained one salient fact. Silas Drum had indeed hired a tracker in August of 1878, contracted through an informal network in San Antonio. The tracker's description matched Hugh Prescott in every particular. And then there was the detail that tilted it all again. According to the merchant's source, whoever had taken that contract had, as of late September, ceased making any reports and was considered in default of the arrangement. Late September. 2 weeks after Hugh Prescott had arrived in Redemption, Kate sat with this for a full evening, turning it in her mind like a stone that showed different colors depending on which way you held it to the light. He had been hired. He had come. And then something had happened that made him stop. He had walked away from the contract. He had stayed not for the job, but because of something else. Because of her, possibly. Because of what he found when he arrived. The actual truth of the situation rather than whatever Drum had told him to expect. She wanted to believe this interpretation completely. She also knew that wanting to believe something was the most reliable way to be wrong about it. She decided to wait and let the truth come to her because it had the habit of doing so eventually. It came on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of January, in the form of Silas Drum walking into her store with 2 men she didn't know and a different quality of confidence than he usually carried. "Good morning, Miss Collins," he said. "Pack what's personal. I need the premises." She looked at him without moving. "You need 2 weeks' notice for that." "The lease says I need to provide 30 days for regular cause," Drum said. "There's a clause for legal dispute. My lawyer advises me the Hargrove matter constitutes grounds to accelerate the terms." This was nonsense, but it was the kind of nonsense that took time and money to contest, and Drum knew it. She looked at the 2 men with him and recognized the calculation. This was a show of force, not a legal proceeding. He wanted her rattled and off balance. "Get out," she said. Drum raised an eyebrow. "Miss Collins, I'll be consulting my own attorney before I do anything regarding this property," she said. "And if you come back into this store with men like these for reasons that are not legitimate business, I will file a complaint with the county that will be a great deal more inconvenient to your business interests than mine." Drum looked at her for a long moment. The new quality of confidence flickered. He turned and left. Kate put her hands flat on the counter after the door closed and breathed steadily. Then she went to find Hugh. She found him behind the store, replacing a rotted post in the fence. She stood in the cold morning light and looked at him and said, "I need you to tell me the truth about why you came to Redemption." He put down the tool he was holding and turned to face her. He had the look of a man who has been waiting for a conversation to arrive and who is not relieved that it has. "Who told you?" he asked. "Does it matter?" "Not especially." He was quiet for a moment. "I was hired last August by an intermediary. I was told a woman in Redemption was sitting on documentary evidence against a man named Hargrove, and the job was to locate the evidence and report its nature and whereabouts. I was told it was a civil investigation. I was told you were a suspect in insurance fraud." The last part hit her like cold water. "Insurance fraud," she repeated. "That's what I was told. I know now it was a lie designed to make the job seem legitimate." His voice was steady, but his eyes were dark with something that wasn't quite guilt, because guilt was passive, this was active, the kind of self-accounting that costs something. "What changed?" she said. "I arrived," he said simply. "I met you, I saw the town. I saw what Hargrove actually did and who Drum actually was. The story I'd been given was completely inverted. You weren't the suspect. You were the victim." He paused. "I stopped reporting. I told the intermediary the trail had gone cold. I never disclosed the existence of your papers. And you stayed. I stayed. She looked at him for a long time. The cold wind moved through the dry grass beyond the fence. A horse shifted somewhere in the distance. Why didn't you tell me? She said. Because I was afraid, he said, and the admission sat between them with its full weight. I was afraid you'd send me away before I could do any good. And I told myself that was practical reasoning, that I could protect your interests better by staying close. But it was also, he stopped, tried again. I found something here I didn't expect to find, and I held onto it longer than was fair to you. Kate absorbed this carefully. Drum is escalating, she said. He came this morning with men. He wants me out of this building. Hugh's expression sharpened. He knows you've been compiling evidence. He must. I need to get to San Antonio before he finds a way to stop me. She looked at Hugh with a directness that was its own kind of decision. I want you to help me, not because of what you were hired to do, but because I'm asking you to. The look on his face at that request was the one she would remember longest, the careful, measuring expression dissolving into something much simpler and much more open. Yes, he said, whatever you need. They left for San Antonio 2 days later, riding before dawn to avoid attracting attention. Kate carried the complete evidence file in a lockbox strapped to her saddlebag. Every receipt, every ledger entry, the fraudulent contract, and 3 sworn statements she had collected from townspeople who had witnessed Hargrove's activities. Over the past 3 months she had built a case that the San Antonio lawyer had told her was, now, genuinely actionable. The ride took 2 days. They stopped at a farmhouse the first night, where the family, a German immigrant couple named Weber who had been friends of Thomas's, gave them supper and a place to sleep. Kate lay in the small guest room listening to the wind and thought about the letter and the intermediary and the inverted story Drum had constructed to make Hugh into a weapon against her. She thought about how close it had come to working. She thought about what it meant that it hadn't. The second morning, crossing the hills south of New Braunfels, Hugh rode beside her in comfortable silence for an hour, and then said, "What are you thinking about?" "The distance between what someone does and why they do it," she said. "Whether the reason matters if the result is the same." "And does it?" he asked. She looked at the road ahead. "I think the reason is what you have to live with after the result is settled," she said. "So yes, I think it matters." They rode into San Antonio in the late afternoon of the second day, and Kate went directly to the law office of a man named Garrett Foster, who was young and sharp, and had been genuinely interested in her case from the first time she had contacted him. She laid the complete file on his desk and walked him through it for 2 hours, and by the end of that meeting Garrett Foster was sitting forward in his chair with the look of a man who has just been handed something he can work with. "This is good," he said. "This is genuinely good. The contract has clear evidence of alteration on the signature line, and with the ledger entries and the witness statements, we have a solid fraud case. The question is locating Hargrove." "I believe he's near Del Rio," Kate said. "If someone were looking." Foster glanced at Hugh. Hugh said nothing, but something in his stillness was communicative. "I can file in district court within the week," Foster said. "If we move quickly, we can put a legal hold on the property before Drum has time to respond." "Do it," Kate said. They stayed 2 nights in San Antonio. On the first evening, Foster took them to dinner at a proper restaurant, the kind of establishment Kate had not been in since Pennsylvania, with actual tablecloths and decent wine, and afterward Hugh walked with her through the lamplit streets of the city, while the evening traffic of carriages and pedestrians flowed around them. "I owe you an apology," he said when they were in a quieter street near the river. "You already gave it," she said. "I gave you an explanation," he said. "An apology is different." She looked at him sideways. "What's the difference?" "An explanation is about context," he said. "An apology is about choosing to hold yourself accountable regardless of context. I should have told you the truth the moment I knew the job was wrong. I didn't because I was afraid of losing something I was starting to value very much. That was selfish and it put you at risk, and I'm sorry." Kate stopped walking. They were on a small bridge over the San Antonio River, the water dark below them, lamplight reflecting in broken pieces on the surface. "I'm not going to tell you it didn't matter," she said quietly, "because it did, and I'm not going to pretend the fear wasn't real because it was." He nodded, accepting that. "But I'm also not going to pretend that what I know now is the same as what I feared then," she said. "You walked away from the contract. You never disclosed my papers. You stayed and helped rebuild something instead of dismantling it. That matters too." "Is it enough?" he asked, and the question was stripped of everything but the genuine need to know. She thought about the letter, about Drum's small eyes and the calculation behind them, about the alley and the lock and the carols, and the cold kiss on the dark porch of her store. She thought about Marcus Aurelius and everything temporary, about what it meant that she was standing on a bridge in San Antonio in January of 1879 instead of being broken and alone in a town that was crumbling. "Ask me again in 6 months," she said. It was not a dismissal. It was a test, and a fair one, and he understood it as such. 6 months, he agreed. They rode back to Redemption 3 days later to find that Garrett Foster had moved faster than expected. A district court order had been filed that morning placing the deed to Kate's building in escrow pending investigation of fraud. Silas Drum would not be able to evict her or do anything with the property until the legal matter was resolved. Drum was not pleased. He arrived at the store the afternoon Kate returned, this time alone, and his composure was thinner than usual. "You've made a significant mistake," he said. "I've made a legal filing," Kate said. "Those are different things. Lawyers cost money. Courts take time. You don't have either." "My lawyer is working on contingency," Kate said, which was true. Foster had agreed to fees contingent on winning the case. And courts are taking less time than they used to, now that the circuit judge has stopped letting back channels influence his schedule. This last part she delivered without particular emphasis, but she watched Drum's face and saw the impact. "I'd be careful," Drum said, "about making enemies." "I'd be careful," Kate replied, "about whose property you're standing in." He left. Hugh, who had been standing near the back of the store during this exchange, said, "He's going to come at this from another angle." "I know," Kate said. "He'll try to find Hargrove and clean up the evidence before the case gets to discovery. He'll also try to make things difficult here to pressure me into settling." "What can I do?" She looked at him. "Keep watch and trust me to handle the legal part." He held her gaze. "Always," he said. The next 6 weeks were a kind of war conducted in slow motion. Drum tried twice to have Hugh removed from town under the pretext that he was causing disturbances, claims that were laughed out of conversation by everyone who knew him. He arranged to have Kate's supply deliveries delayed from Fredericksburg, which she countered by organizing a buying cooperative with 2 other merchants and going direct to San Antonio for supplies. He spread the story of her marriage to Thomas, suggesting that she had come west on Thomas's reputation and had no legitimate claim to the business she had built, which Kate addressed by simply continuing to do her work so well that the story dissolved for lack of purchase. Through all of it, Hugh was steady. Not dramatic, not making speeches or drawing his gun, just present and capable and honest, which was harder and more valuable than either. Garrett Foster, meanwhile, located Martin Hargrove. The man had not, in fact, fled to Del Rio. He had gone to Laredo, married a woman who didn't know his history, and set himself up as a land agent. When the court summons arrived, he hired a lawyer in Laredo who sent a lengthy and impressive series of objections. But the documentary evidence was too solid, and in March of 1879, Hargrove appeared in San Antonio District Court and could not explain the signature line alterations on the contract. Kate rode to San Antonio for the hearing with Hugh beside her and Garrett Foster in front, and she sat in the wood-paneled courtroom with her hands folded in her lap and listened to the judge deliver a finding that the contract was fraudulent and that the deed to her building was to be restored to her ownership immediately. It was a complete and total victory. She had not let herself believe it completely until the judge said the words aloud, and then she allowed herself one moment of enormous, shaking relief before she composed herself and thanked Foster and shook his hand and turned to Hugh. He was looking at her with an expression of uncomplicated happiness that she had not seen on his face before, and it broke something open in her that she had kept very carefully sealed. She didn't trust herself to speak. She put her hand on his arm for a moment briefly, and then they walked out into the San Antonio spring sunlight, and she breathed the warm air and felt, for the first time in 3 years, like something that had been taken was fully and finally returned. On the ride back to Redemption on the second day, they stopped at noon beside a creek to rest the horses. The hill country was at its spring best, the cedar and live oak budding, the creek running clear and cold from recent rain. Kate sat on a flat rock with her boots off, her feet in the cold water, and felt the particular piece of a problem that is genuinely resolved rather than merely postponed. Hugh sat on the bank nearby looking at the water. She watched his profile and thought again about the 6 months she had asked for. It had been 4 months, close enough. "You asked me to ask you again," he said without looking up because he had always been able to follow her thinking in a way that still slightly startled her. "I did," she said. "Is it enough?" he asked again. The same stripped, genuine question. She looked at the water running over her feet. She thought about what she knew and what remained uncertain, and she found, with a kind of quiet surprise, that the uncertainty had become acceptable. Not ignorable, she would always want to know, always be learning. But it was the acceptable uncertainty that came with knowing a person rather than the threatening uncertainty that came from suspecting deception. "Yes," she said, "it's enough." He looked at her then. The calculating, measuring expression was entirely gone. What was in its place was something open and certain and very serious. "I love you," he said, as if he had been holding it at exactly the right distance until the moment was right, and had decided the moment was right. "I want you to know that clearly, without conditions attached." Kate felt the warmth of it move through her like the April sunlight on the water. She moved from the rock and sat beside him on the bank close so that their shoulders touched. "I love you too," she said, "without conditions attached." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they sat by the creek in the hill country spring for a long, quiet, happy time while the water ran and the horses grazed and the world continued its patient turning. Back in Redemption, things clarified quickly. The restoration of Kate's deed was noted by the entire town, with the satisfaction that attaches to a fair outcome, in a place where fair outcomes are not always guaranteed. Silas Drum did not capitulate gracefully. Drum was not a graceful man, but the legal situation had foreclosed his most useful angles, and over the following weeks his position in town shifted from dominant to merely prominent, which was its own kind of justice. More pertinently, it emerged in the course of Foster's investigation that Drum's various property acquisitions had involved the same patterns of fraud used in the Hargrove matter, and once Kate's case established the method, 2 other affected property owners brought their own complaints. By June, Silas Drum was engaged with so much legal trouble that he had very little time or energy to spend making life difficult for anyone in Redemption. Carlos's father, whose land was one of those affected, recovered ownership of a portion of his property that Drum had claimed through similar manipulation. Kate attended the hearing in Fredericksburg and testified on his behalf about the pattern she had documented, and the look of relief on the older man's face when the decision came through was one of the most satisfying things she witnessed in a year of satisfying things. In May, Hugh helped Kate expand the store. She had recovered not only the building but a portion of the money Hargrove had taken. The court-ordered restitution was partial, Hargrove having spent freely in Laredo, but it was enough, combined with the store's returning income, to add a second room for dry goods and to hire a part-time assistant. The assistant was a 19-year-old woman named Clara who had recently arrived in Redemption with her parents, and who had a head for numbers and absolutely no patience for nonsense, qualities Kate admired immediately. The expansion was completed in June, and on a warm evening after the last board was in place and painted, Kate and Hugh sat on the front porch of the store with 2 glasses of whiskey, the good kind, not the medicinal kind, and she asked him about the future, in the direct way she had learned was the most efficient approach to important conversations. "What are you thinking?" she said. "About whether you'd consider a more formal arrangement," he said, with a care that was somewhat at odds with his usual directness and which she found, for that reason, entirely endearing. "Define formal," she said. "Marriage," he said, "if you'd have me." The simplicity of it was perfect. No elaborate speech, no flourishes, just the direct offer of himself, accountable and clear. Kate looked at her whiskey glass and then at him and felt the same opening sensation she had felt by the creek in April, but more so. Larger, more settled. "I would," she said. "I'd have you." He smiled, a real smile, the full version she had seen only a handful of times, which made it worth seeing. It transformed his face completely. They were married in July of 1879, in Reverend Cade's almost finished church, in front of most of the town of Redemption, and with Martha Elkins crying happily in the front pew and Doc Hennessy trying to pretend he wasn't. Carlos carried the flowers. Garrett Foster rode up from San Antonio for the occasion and pronounced it the most satisfying professional outcome he had ever had, which made Kate laugh. The ceremony was brief, and the celebration afterward was long and excellent. Abe Greer provided the best whiskey from the saloon's reserve. Mabel Oakes produced a wedding cake of astonishing quality that she had been quietly preparing for 2 weeks, because Mabel had made her assessment of Hugh Prescott months ago and had simply been waiting for the relevant adults to catch up. Kate danced with Hugh in the warm July dark outside the saloon, with the fiddle playing something quick and bright, and she thought about the woman who had stood at Thomas's grave 4 years ago and understood she was entirely alone. She wanted to tell that woman something. She wasn't sure it would help. Grief didn't work that way, and alone was what she had been, and there was no shortcutting through it. But she wanted to tell her that what was coming was worth the work of getting to it. The night of her wedding, Kate wrote in her journal, a habit she had kept since arriving in Redemption, and the last line of that entry was, "I have been practical so long." It is extraordinary what happens when you allow yourself to simply be happy. The summer passed into autumn, and the autumn into winter, and their life together in Redemption had the quality of something built well, solid under ordinary pressure, flexible where flexibility was needed, and better with time. Hugh continued to do what he did: repair work, informal security, the occasional task for neighboring farms that needed a capable hand and a fair price, and Kate ran the store with the expanded scope of someone who had stopped defending her position and started building on it. She taught Hugh the full details of the bookkeeping system. He taught her a more systematic approach to tracking inventory. She read Marcus Aurelius and argued cheerfully with his more fatalistic passages. He read her copy of George Eliot's Middlemarch and declared it one of the more accurate descriptions of how people actually worked that he had encountered, which was not a small endorsement from a man who had made a career of reading people. In the spring of 1880, Kate learned she was pregnant. She told Hugh on an evening in March, sitting at the kitchen table of the small house they had built behind the store the previous autumn. Hugh had done most of the construction himself, refusing to hire out the work he could do with his own hands, and Kate had helped on the weekends, which led to the running joke that she was a better estimator of measurements than he was, which was entirely true. He absorbed the news with the same controlled quality he brought to everything important, which meant the expression he showed was a fraction of what he actually felt, but she knew him well enough now to read the fraction accurately. "Say something," she said. He stopped, started again. "I'm very happy," he said. "That's the accurate word. I'm very happy." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. He turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat in the warm kitchen with the spring wind at the window and were very happy, both of them, in the particular thorough way that comes from having worked for something and found it worth every bit of the work. Their son was born in October of 1880. They named him James Thomas Prescott, James for Hugh's father, Thomas for Kate's husband, whose grave outside town had a stone Kate kept clean, and whose memory she honored as the honest thing it was. A love that had happened and mattered, separate from and not in competition with the love that had followed. James Thomas Prescott was a vigorous, loud, opinionated person from approximately his first hour, and Kate looked at him in the October light and felt something enormous and specific and entirely new. Hugh held his son with the careful precision of a man who has not held many infants and is acutely aware of the fragility involved, and Kate watched him make the slow discovery that the fragility also included him, that he was now more vulnerable to the world than he had ever been, because there was now something in it he could not afford to lose. Martha Elkins visited that evening and declared James the finest baby she had seen in 3 years, which was statistically ambiguous given the small town, but felt exactly right. Reverend Cade baptized James in December, in the now completed church, which had taken 2 years of intermittent effort, and which had been worth every delay because the finished thing was genuinely beautiful, plain and spare in the frontier way, but well-made, with tall windows that let in the light. Hugh had built the 2 front pews himself and refused any payment for it, which Cade had accepted with the grace of a man who knew better than to argue with a determined craftsman. Martin Hargrove served his sentence in the Bixar County Jail, 1 year and restitution, and upon release moved to Louisiana and was not heard from again in the hill country. Silas Drum settled his various legal troubles by selling his redemption properties at reduced prices to cover his legal debts, and left for Dallas in the winter of 1880 to pursue whatever came next for a man of his particular character. The building he had held through the fraudulent deed was bought at public auction by Kate Collins Prescott for a price that was satisfying in its fairness. The railroad spur that everyone had expected finally came to redemption in 1881, through a revised survey route that brought it 15 miles closer than anyone had anticipated. The town expanded quickly after that. New merchants, new families, the particular energy of a place that has been waiting and suddenly has reason to move. Kate's store expanded again, this time to a full commercial establishment with 3 full-time employees, including Clara, who had proven as reliable as Kate had suspected, and who had, in the fullness of time, developed an understanding with a young surveyor who arrived with the railroad company, an understanding that became a marriage in the autumn of 1881 in the same church where Kate and Hugh had been married. Kate attended Clara's wedding with James on her hip and Hugh beside her, and felt the particular pleasure of being present at someone else's happiness, which is one of the privileges of having found your own. In the spring of 1882, Kate learned she was pregnant again. This time Hugh absorbed the news with considerably less controlled precision and considerably more immediate, unguarded happiness, which made Kate laugh in a way she would remember for a long time. Their daughter was born in November of 1882 and named Margaret Ruth Prescott, Margaret for no one in particular, simply because it was a strong name they both liked, and Ruth because Kate had always found that particular biblical book quietly powerful in its depiction of loyalty chosen rather than inherited. Margaret was quieter than James had been, and more observant, watching the world from her first months with wide, serious eyes that looked remarkably like Hugh's calculating gaze, and which Kate found both recognizable and delightful. James, at 2 years old, took the arrival of his sister with the generous indifference of a small person who has very many things to do and is willing to accommodate one more, provided it doesn't interfere with the important business of examining rocks and following the store cat around the house. Through all of this, The babies and the railroad and the town's growth and the satisfying defeats of Drum and Hargrove. There was the thing that ran underneath everything else, the thing that was never dramatic because it didn't need to be, because it was simply true and reliable and ongoing. Hugh and Kate, on an ordinary evening, sitting on the porch of the house they had built, in the dark after the children were asleep, with the hill country spreading out around them in all its enduring indifference to human concerns. The same porch where they had learned to sit in comfortable quiet, where they had fought occasionally, and made up with the thoroughness of people who knew each other well enough to be genuinely honest in an argument. Where they had built the particular language of two people who have chosen each other deliberately and continue to choose each other daily, which is the only form of love that lasts. Kate, in the last evening of 1882, sitting with a cup of coffee while Hugh read by lamplight, looked at him and thought about all the specific things she knew about him now. The way he woke before she did every morning and was always quiet about it. The way he still carried the Meditations in his pocket even though he had read it so many times the cover was gone. The way he made the children laugh by telling completely deadpan and elaborate stories about imaginary horses he claimed to have owned. The way he still managed his expressions around strangers with that careful control but had entirely stopped managing them around her, so that she saw everything now, the full uncalibrated face of him. She thought about the woman who had watched him walk into her store with flour and salt and coffee, and who had decided he was not just a drifter. That woman had been right in a way she couldn't have predicted. He was not just anything. He was Hugh Prescott, bounty hunter turned carpenter turned general store partner turned husband turned father, a man who had come to redemption on a crooked errand and stayed for a reason that was entirely his own, a choice he had made before he was quite ready to explain it, and had spent the rest of his time earning. "What are you thinking about?" he asked without looking up from his book, the same question he had asked on that November ride south, because it was a question they asked each other regularly now, being people who valued the inside of the other's mind. "You," she said. He looked up, smiled the full smile, the real one. "What about me?" he asked. She looked at the dark hills and the stars coming out over the cedar breaks, the hill country winter quiet around them, the children asleep inside. "That everything temporary leads eventually to everything permanent," she said, "if you let it." He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "Marcus Aurelius would argue with that." "Marcus Aurelius didn't have this," she said. Hugh looked at her with that open, uncalibrated expression, and then he set down his book and reached across and took her hand, and they sat together in the last dark of 1882 while redemption, Texas settled into a quiet it had earned, and the new year came in cold and clear and full of everything that was still ahead of them. The bounty man had come to report and stayed to love. The woman who had built a life from nothing and had it taken and built it again had finally stopped waiting for the next thing to go wrong. The town whose name was a promise had, over the course of these years, done its best to keep it. And in the house behind the general store, in the warm light of a January night, two people who had come to each other through deception and discovered within it something entirely genuine went on choosing each other with the everyday, unheroic, entirely sufficient devotion that was, in the end, the most radical thing either of them had ever done. Hugh Prescott had a lot of things in his past he was not proud of. He had held those things carefully and carried them honestly and spent his best years working against them, which is the most a person can do with a dark past. Kate Collins Prescott had been robbed of things she had built with her own hands and gotten them back through her own effort and found in the process that she was harder and more capable and more willing to trust than she had known. Together, they were something neither had been able to be separately. Certain. James Prescott, at 3, would later tell anyone who asked that his father had the best stories and his mother knew everything. He was correct on both counts. Margaret Prescott would grow up in the hill country with her mother's precision and her father's stillness, and her own particular way of looking at the world that was entirely her own, which is the most any parent can hope for. The store expanded twice more in the 1880s. The house got a proper parlor in 1884. Hugh built a reading corner in it with shelves he made himself, filling slowly with the books they collected. Marcus Aurelius in a new binding, George Eliot, a history of Texas that was partly wrong and partly fascinating, a full run of Harper's Weekly from 1880 forward, and eventually a row of children's books that James read to Margaret with the solemn authority of an older sibling who takes the responsibility very seriously. Outside, redemption grew. The railroad brought prosperity and diversity, and the complicated negotiations of a town becoming more than it had been. Kate was part of that negotiation, on the town council by 1884, which was unusual for a woman but not unprecedented in Texas, where the frontier's practical demands had a way of overriding certain conventions. She argued for a proper school and got it. She argued for fair water rights for the Mexican farming families south of town and got most of what she asked for. She made enemies in the process, and she was fine with that, because she had learned the hard way that enemies made for the right reasons were a form of testimony. Hugh, asked once by Garrett Foster, who had become a genuine friend and visited annually, whether he had any regrets about the way things had worked out, thought about it for long enough that Foster began to look worried. "One," Hugh said finally. "What's that?" "That it took me 2 weeks to tell her the truth when it should have taken 2 hours, he said. "But she forgave me for it, which is the best thing that's ever happened to me." Foster raised his glass. "To the best thing," he said. Hugh raised his glass and thought of Kate in the store, behind the counter she owned legitimately and completely, with the lamplight on her dark red hair and the children in the next room and the hill country all around her, and everything that had been threatened and lost and fought for and recovered laid out in its final and satisfying arrangement. "To the best thing," he said. The night of the confrontation, the moment where Sela's drum pressed a gun to Hugh's temple in the January street and demanded he confess his hidden motive, the moment where Kate watched from 20 feet away with her hand on her own pistol, and the word bounty, falling through her like a stone, ended not with violence but with truth. Hugh said Kate's name across the dirt street, and Drum had his moment of dramatic revelation, and Kate had listened, and then she had lowered her gun and looked at Drum with a clarity that stopped him mid-sentence. "I already know," she said. Drum blinked. "I've known for 2 months," she said. "I've had the evidence. I filed the papers. And what I know that you didn't count on is that the man you hired is no longer working for you." She looked at Hugh, standing perfectly still with the gun at his head, and what she saw in his face was not guilt, not really. It was the same serious, open expression that had been looking at her since October. "Are you all right?" "Yes," Hugh said. Drum turned the barrel uncertainly, the confidence draining. "Put the gun down, Silas," Kate said, in the tone she used for invoices that weren't being paid. "You're in enough trouble with the courts without adding this to it." Drum looked from her to Hugh and back, calculating. His 2 men from the store visit were not here. He was alone with a plan that had just revealed its own failure, and the woman at the center of it was looking at him with something worse than fear. She was looking at him with complete, settled, entirely unimpressed certainty. He put the gun down. Kate watched him go, turning down the street toward his office with the diminished gait of a man who has lost the argument that mattered. And then she crossed the 20 feet of Texas dirt and stood in front of Hugh Prescott and looked at him carefully. "You came here for me," she said, not accusing, clarifying. "Not the way he said," Hugh replied. "Not the way I came." "No," she agreed. "Not the way you stayed." He looked at her, and she looked at him in the morning light of a Texas winter street, with everything that had been revealed and survived and resolved between them, and what was left after the betrayal and the hidden motive and the forced choice and all the dark past that had been carried and set down. What was left was simply this: 2 people standing in a street, in a town called Redemption, choosing each other. Which it turned out was enough. Which in the end was more than enough. Which was everything.